Good morning. This is the Transportation Infrastructure Committee for the City of Kansas City, Missouri. My name is Russ Johnson, and I am the chair of this committee, and I also work for the 2nd District. Thank you.
Dick Davis, 1st District.
Cindy Circle, Mayor Pro Tem, 5th District at large.
Jermaine Reed from the 3rd District.
All right. Today on the agenda, we have the Taxicab Comprehensive Analysis. Mr. Schulte is here to present. Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the Transportation Infrastructure Committee, Troy Schulte, City Manager. Want to spend a little bit of time kind of walking through in detail the proposed revisions and a little bit about the process. I first want to thank city staff, Kathy Adams, Jim Reddy, Rick Usher, Chris Hernandez, who did the yeoman's work on this effort to try to systematically look at all of the options as we looked at Chapter 76. A little bit about the process. We're going to try something a little different, and it's entirely up to the committee's discretion. We have had good process in terms of taking a lot of public input into these proposed revisions. We've had 2 public hearings, reasonably well attended, and we have met with all of the major stakeholder groups over the last 90 days. And I truly do appreciate their input and their suggestions on how we can take already a very good ordinance, one of the models in the country, and I think it's important that we're starting from a position of strength, and how do we make it even better as we deal with the modernization, the diversifying of the transportation industry, the transportation for hire industry, while still protecting those core public values of protecting public safety and ensuring a level playing field for our residents and our businesses to participate in the city. So would suggest a little bit of a different process. What we have is a draft ordinance that we'll be presenting to you today. And if it's up to the committee's pleasure, we have reviewed the possibility of presenting it to you and then holding it for 30 more days for public comment. We'll post it online, take more public comment on the process as it's still a draft ordinance, and then our intent, subject to your approval and consideration, would be to introduce an ordinance around the 1st of March for formal approval and adoption. But wanted to get more public input into this process. It's a process that's modeled after the city of Dallas. As we were reviewing the work of other cities, we kind of like this process as a means to make sure that it's a deliberative process. There's ample opportunity for public input into the proposed changes. Chance for us to make final edits and incorporate any final changes that might actually be warranted after people had a chance to review the specific language. So what I will do now is turn it over to Jim Reddy, who will walk through a PowerPoint presentation on the details of the proposed changes, how we derive those changes, and then open it up for further conversation. So again, I want to thank the tremendous work of staff and all of the stakeholders who were very actively engaged in this process. And I think we've got a good product that we will again to set the bar for how cities regulate and allow the market to work in these transportation for hire ordinances. So, Jim, without further ado, I'll let you take it away.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Thank you for the time. Real quickly, I'm going to do exactly that. I'm just going to walk you through this process and give you the highlights of the ordinance, of the things that we've went through on this. Let's see here. Okay, so first slide. Why is it so important to regulate transportation network companies and vehicles? To provide for public safety. If the city is going to permit vehicles for hire, they need to take steps to assure that any person that will be providing vehicle transportation service to the public does not have a questionable background. Anybody who will provide transportation service needs to have a criminal background investigation completed to assure that they do not pose a threat to the riding public. As far as what the city manager was talking about earlier, were other city ordinances reviewed to see how they regulate the transportation network companies? Of course they were. And the key ones that we looked at were Austin, Texas, Chicago, Illinois, Dallas, Texas, Houston, Texas, Little Rock, Arkansas, Memphis, Tennessee, Minneapolis, Minnesota, Salt Lake City, Utah, Seattle, Washington, Tacoma, Washington, Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Washington, D.C. We started with some of the changes on the keys. Here was a new Title IV, Division 7 under Chapter 76. The former title used to be called Taxicab Code, which really just dealt with taxicabs, where it's now going to be called Vehicles for Hire Code. And this is a much more accurate description of what this is about, mainly because it talks about taxicab vehicles, livery vehicles, sightseeing vehicles, charitable nonprofit transportation vehicles, pedicabs, and now transportation network companies and transportation network vehicles. So it's much more inclusive and is titled more correctly. Definitions added, there were a few, but specifically they were for the transportation network driver, transportation network company, transportation network service, transportation network vehicle, and vehicle permit. Initial inspections were eliminated. This is one of the things that we considered. Changes to Section 7640C, whereby the city will no longer make initial inspections of livery, sightseeing, pedicab, and transportation network vehicles. There are a couple reasons basically for this. The ordinance already requires that vehicles must be maintained in a clean and serviceable condition and in adequate repair, and lists specific details as to how the vehicles must be maintained. Also, regulated industries requires proof that all vehicles have passed a state inspection before a vehicle permit is issued. So we didn't see the need in having to do duplicate process on this. More so, if a regulated industries legal investigator were out in the field and ordered a vehicle out of service for safety or mechanical reasons, the permit holder must have the vehicle re-inspected by my office in order to for it to be placed back in service. This is something that we already do, but we're keeping that intact. And then lastly, taxicabs will continue to be inspected on an annual basis and biannual basis to ensure at a minimum that taximeters are accurate and are sealed by city staff. The taxi vehicle is just a lot more different than the rest of vehicles discussed, and that's why it's more important that we have to do those biannual inspections. Transportation network company requirements. This is probably some of the biggest changes you will see in the ordinance. This is a new addition. 7646 requires all transportation network providers to apply for and receive a permit from Regulated Industries Division at no cost. This ensures that they follow all transportation network ordinances. Other requirements of this section include identifying a person that will represent the company and will be authorized to make decisions on the company's behalf, which include receiving notices and tickets. A statement signed by the applicant of the transportation network company that they will not allow transportation network drivers to utilize their transportation network service until they have met all the requirements of this chapter and are in good standing with me. A statement signed by the applicant that they will allow the director or their authorized agents or any member of the police department full access to their transportation network service for investigative purposes. This goes back to the actual transportation network service, like if it's the phone app. Whenever that's out, we need to be able to have access to that if we're going to be able to do a good job regulating these types of businesses. Next change, taxicabs no longer operating as livery vehicles. In Section 7670, the option of a taxicab to be operated as a livery vehicle was eliminated. The reason for this is taxicabs are currently allowed to operate as livery vehicles, whereby a taxicab driver can prearrange a trip with a customer at a set fare rather than by using the taximeter. Ultimately, by allowing taxicabs to operate as livery vehicles, it provides opportunity for a taxicab driver to arrange a price that is higher than what the taximeter would charge a citizen otherwise. This change will require a taxicab driver to only charge a passenger the fare that is recorded on the taximeter. This keeps the distinction clear between a taxicab vehicle and a livery vehicle to both vehicle for hire operators and to the public. A reduction in vehicle permit fees, something we looked long and hard at. Basically changes to Section 7675. We're proposing we lower those from $300 per vehicle permit to $250 per vehicle permit for taxicab, livery, sightseeing, and transportation network vehicles. We currently permit 547 taxicabs and 125 livery vehicles, which equates to annual permit revenues of about $201,000+. If we decrease the price of livery permits by $50 and we increase the number of vehicles permitted by 100, the revenue generated would be about $193,000, which is a loss of only $8,600.
Jim, I might jump in. This is an important distinction when we talk about the fees. One of the things that the transportation network provider companies continued to express was the barrier to entry that the perceived fees were going to create. Here's where we had to balance the need to encourage access to the market while maintaining a long tradition and a council policy that the Regulated Industries Division is fully fee supported. It does not receive any general fund support. So the fees that it generates by regulating the utilities, the industries that it regulates, fully pay for the cost of its operations. So that was one of the balancing mechanisms that we had It would be very easy for us to cut the fee, but then we would have had to subsidize its operation from some other, so we were able to tweak the fees a little bit, try to simplify reduce the barriers to entry, reduce some of the bureaucratic steps that were necessary. But I think this is an important distinction. But I wanted to get that out there, is that Regulated Industries has never received any general fund support, and we wanted to keep that way going forward.
So, and then lastly, the last bullet point, it just talks about, why did we use the number 100? Right now, with Uber, there's a Facebook group out there where they have 130 drivers on this group. So although we have no way of knowing for certain how many operators we might come our way or new permits we'll get, we have a pretty decent rough estimate that, 100 plus around there will probably translate. So it should offset any, or be close to offsetting any changes that we made. So it does make the barrier a lot less cumbersome for especially part-time drivers that are trying to do this for a living. Criminal background investigation. Section 76104 has been changed to allow an applicant to have the option of choosing the city or a qualified company to conduct a background check. This is something that certainly the transportation network companies, was something that they really wanted. In order to do that, if an applicant chooses a third-party company to conduct their background check, the applicant must authorize the release of the investigation and require the investigation company to send a copy of the applicant's background investigation report to me. This practice gives the transportation network company or the driver the flexibility of choosing who they would like to conduct their background check, while assuring that the city will be provided proof that the drivers will meet the requirements to drive a vehicle for hire in Kansas City, Missouri. The physical examination, a little bit of a change here, and this is again something the transportation network companies brought up, and they thought it was a barrier. It used to be that 76104, we only used to require that a physical examination be presented to us to prove that a person was in good health. We've changed that to say that they can either provide a current physical examination or a written statement from a licensed physician, general practitioner, or primary care physician stating that they are physically able to drive a vehicle for hire. The physical examination or written statement is good for a period of 3 years. This again is just to make sure that there's no physical, reason that a person wouldn't be behind a vehicle for hire before they're going to take it out in the city. Insurance requirements. There's a lot of information here, but this is the biggest part just to get to. Briefly summarize the requirements. Transportation network companies are required to have an insurance policy in place which covers all vehicles and drivers. From the time a driver accepts a passenger to the time the passenger exits the vehicle, the commercial insurance policy shall be the primary insurance policy. From the time a transportation network driver accepts a ride request to the time the passenger exits the vehicle must have commercial automobile liability coverage with a combined single limit liability for injury or property damage for each occurrence of $1 million. Trade dress. This just goes back to how the vehicles look. Changes to Section 234 have been made to address uniformity with regard to livery and transportation network vehicles. Any sign or emblem to be placed or affixed on a livery or transportation network vehicle must be approved by the director prior to use. Once a sign or emblem has been approved, it must be used on all vehicles at all times while those vehicles are being used to provide transportation services. This way, if there's a vehicle out there that wants to stick a mustache on its front grille, that's fine, but they got to be used at all times. This not only lets my investigators know that these vehicles are out there operating, but it also lets the general public know, okay, this is what these vehicles look like. So it kind of works good for both ways. Rates and receipts. Section 76239 has been changed to state that livery and transportation network vehicles shall be for hire at a charge fixed by written agreement in advance, where the livery or transportation network company must provide a passenger with the rate in advance of the ride. A driver must give the passenger a legible receipt to include the rate, total fare, name and phone number of the company, and the name of the driver. The receipt may also be submitted to the passenger electronically within 2 hours of payment if the passenger is also in agreement with that. And then lastly, I just want to go back and say a special thanks, and Mr. Schulte already summarized this, but certainly appreciate all those that came out there from the taxi and livery industry, from Uber and Lyft employees and representatives that talked about this process, all those that took time out of their busy schedules to discuss and provide testimony at the Kansas City North Community Center on November 19th, in the Southeast Community Center on December the 10th. And finally, an extra special thanks to Andrea Young, a law student at UMKC, for the information she provided to this project for the city. So at this time, that wraps up my presentation on this, and be happy to answer any questions or any of us.
Okay.
I might quickly summarize. There were a couple of areas that we looked at and evaluated very closely. One was the current limitation on the number of taxicab permits, which is currently at 500. We had some conversation, well, quite a bit of conversation about the impact of lifting that cap. Other cities have done that, and with mixed degree of success. We decided at this point to leave the cap in place, recognizing that the transportation network providers can come in under a different mechanism. But so we've left the cap at 500 place. The big issue, the direction that we went back and forth and really tried to find some way to ground our decision making in, and we weren't able to do it, quite honestly, was the question of exclusives. That was an issue that is a very big concern. The exclusive contracts that our large taxi cab companies are negotiating with hotels and venues around the city. We looked at that, not only some legal parameters, but also what other cities were doing. Exclusive contracts appear to be fairly common in this industry among the larger providers. What we ran into was the issue of it would be very possible for us to say taxicab companies can enter into exclusive agreements with hotels. However, we don't regulate hotels, so there would be absolutely no way for the city to regulate the hotels from entering into an exclusive, reversing the relationship and entering into an exclusive provider with the transportation company. So that's the area that we wrestled with. Kathy Adams is here and can provide a lot more detail on that particular decision. I know that was of concern to Councilman Davis and really started the conversation on the regulation. We just felt we did not have the legal standing to go after, to be able to regulate that in a manner that would be effective. So I imagine that will be the point of contention over the next couple of weeks as we evaluate this proposal. But I just wanted to lay those two issues out. We did not change the cap on the number of permitted taxi cabs in the city, and we did not address the issue of exclusives because we just felt there wasn't enough legal standing for us to do that. Jim, it was you might quickly mention the concept of driver permits. That question came to me, and as to what if any changes we're making in that process as it goes forward in the proposed ordinance.
Sure. And just quickly, as far as whenever a driver comes in to get a driver's certificate, the biggest change that we've made, we've condensed everything down to a one-stop shop. And in my office, I've got 6 legal investigators, and I've got one dedicated to this. So it takes quite a bit of effort to try to condense everything down, but we've done that. And what we have done is we're going to get a new computer system at some point down the road too as well. Intergov will be coming online, and that's going to help us a lot because we'll be able to take payments online and do even more. But until that time, right now, we are, like I say, streamlining the process where as long as an applicant gives us all of their information first, so if they give us their, the proof of their physical examination, their driving record, we conduct a background check, then we'll have them come in at one time. We'll verify who they are with their Social Security card and their driver's license. We'll at that time print their card so they'll have that on their person. We'll go ahead and have them go through their English/city test as far as where landmarks are, and then we'll go ahead and issue them the permit for their vehicle and issue their driver's certificate at once. So we have streamlined it to try to make it a one-stop shop. That's the biggest change with the process there, and hopefully that's been in place for a little bit, and some of the kinks are still getting worked out, but for the most part it seems like it's working fairly well.
I'm confused about one issue, or maybe you presented it and I just didn't catch it, but essentially what I heard is you're going to have things that have taxi meters and things that don't. Is that correct?
Yes.
And the things that have taxi meters are going to still be capped at 500 and whatever the number is?
500.
500. And the things that don't will be uncapped?
Correct. That's the way the ordinance has been. It's the way it was written before. So the only thing we looked at, like Mr. Schulte said, was, well, do we want to uncap the taxi cabs? And after looking at everything, we just decided not to do that at this time. There's no, I mean, if we wanted to do that down the road, we certainly could, but right now it didn't seem like it made a lot of sense to us to do that. So we just left it as status quo the way it's always been. Nothing, right now, like I say, I have 125 delivery vehicles. That's jumped up about by 40 or 45 over the last 2 years. So more people are coming into this, but there's no barrier to stop anybody from driving for any transportation network company or delivery company otherwise.
So, and a vehicle with a taxi meter is a vehicle that you can just walk into without having to do anything before. You don't have to touch your phone or anything else. You can just walk in and start riding, and then that meter regulates the fee, not some pre-agreed arrangement.
That is correct.
Okay. Thank you. All right. Ms. Circo.
Back to the sign approval. You mentioned the mustache, and that's very visible, and you're saying that has, if they're driving for hire, that has to be on there the whole time. But that's not how Uber works. I've used them in other cities, and they identify the car by the app and tell you, but there's not a sign on the car. So just give me the difference there.
It's basically, all this says is if you're going to have a trade dress, you don't have to have one, but if you have one, you have to use it consistently throughout. So if somebody wants to have a mustache, then they're going to have to put it on all their vehicles and use them at all times when they're out there providing the service. But if someone decides not to, that's fine too. I think the way I understand this, all the transportation network companies, if you get a ride from them, they're going to let you know the driver, about when they're going to be there, how they look, the make of the car. So, the person will know that, but we're just trying to say, appearance-wise, it's kind of like our taxi cabs. Right now, if you're going to drive a taxi cab, they all have to be a uniform color. They all have to have the same written identity on all of them, so they all match. It's going to be that same concept with any of the transportation network companies. If they choose not to have anything, just like delivery vehicles now, a lot of your black six-passenger Lincoln Town cars, they don't have anything on them, and that's fine. But if they choose to have something, they all have to have it, or none of them have it. They just have to go one way or the other.
That's you.
Quite frankly, I'm concerned and disappointed about your recommendation on the exclusionary vehicles. The resolution that we passed asked you to determine if, in fact, the existing process was discriminatory. It reflected the fact that in our city, every single other owner-operator south of the river is either a minority or female-owned company. And the exclusionary agreements mean that all of those, the existing companies or the replacements, cannot compete on a fair playing field. Did you, essentially, the ordinance asked you to determine whether that was, in essence, discriminatory or something we should be concerned about. Did you conclude it was not discriminatory?
We looked at that very, long and hard, without a doubt. And to be honest with you, I'm going to defer to...
what?
What's that?
I didn't hear what you said.
Yeah, we looked at that issue. We spent a lot of time looking at that issue and kicking it around. There's no doubt about it. And that was the first thing that we looked at, just like city manager said. The first thing we studied was that first before we moved into this section. I'm going to defer a little bit to Ms. Adams because she can talk a little bit more about the legality issues, but we found legality issues that was going to prevent us from doing something.
All I'm asking is, did you determine yes or no it was not discriminatory, the process? I'm not asking for a legal opinion. I'm asking of whether we've got a discriminatory process out there.
No, we did not find it.
You do not think it's discriminatory?
No.
Thank you. I'm also a little bit concerned that you said the reason that you could not, well, first of all, if you didn't think it's discriminatory, I don't know why you do anything, but I think it is. Second, you determined that we could not, in essence, restricted cabs from contracting with hotels because hotels weren't regulated by the city and couldn't be. But it would appear that if there were a regulation that forbid the cab companies from having that ordinance in place, that's enough to enforce the ordinance. One party's violating the law, the other one doesn't. That doesn't make it a problem in terms of enforcement? I'm asking.
And if I understand correctly, we can regulate, there's precedent out there that we can regulate taxis, and we can do it for public safety reasons. Could we require them not to have an exclusive agreement? There's precedent out there that, yes, we could. The problem comes in, we cannot require hotels. We do not regulate hotels that own their own property. They can have any taxi they want to come up on their property, or they can choose not to allow any taxi come up on their property. And so in order to regulate them, yes, we could do something for public safety on the taxi side. That's still not going to affect the hotels that made it very clear that they would still continue to use exclusively one taxi company. And they have that right to do that.
But if the cab company did it and it violated our ordinance, we couldn't enforce it.
I guess if you're asking, did a taxi cab enter into an exclusive agreement, that would violate an ordinance if we had one on the books.
Right.
Still does not stop the hotels from only allowing certain taxis on their property, and that would not be a violation.
No, but the cab company that did it would be in violation, wouldn't it?
No,
Why
because
not?
it's not an exclusive contract. It's the hotel's preference to only use one taxi.
All right, but we're talking about exclusive contracts and whether exclusive contracts should be forbidden. You're right. Absent an exclusive contract, a hotel could say, "Yellow, you're the only one that can operate there." I understand that. But our issue was there are exclusive contracts. I think the exclusive contracts are discriminatory, and I think they should be forbidden. And you're telling me that that we can't do that.
That's not what I said. I said the city
But we
can
can't enforce it.
The city can enact ordinances that, for safety reasons, and again, there would have to be a public safety reasons for excluding exclusive contracts. There's precedent out there from Florida that they did just exactly that. What we cannot do is tell a hotel that they cannot exclusively use a particular taxi
I
company.
understand that.
The hotels made it very clear in all the testimony they provided, regardless of whether there was a contract or not, they were only going to use one particular taxi company. That would not be a violation. If there's no exclusive contract, there is no violation.
And I'm satisfied with that, but I am concerned that exclusionary contracts should be enforceable if they were there. Now, you're right, a hotel could do what it wants to do, but I cannot imagine why we can't say something that exclusionary contracts are not allowed and enforce that.
We can say that for taxis.
That's what I wanted to do. That's what we
And
wanted to do.
I drafted an ordinance to that effect, and it did not pass out. My understanding, it's still being held.
The ordinance that I recall provided a fine for I know the ordinance you're talking about. The ordinance did not forbid those contracts. It was my recollection. That's why I held it. I was the sponsor of it.
Correct. It prohibited exclusive contracts for public safety reasons.
Troy, could I ask you to embellish on why you concluded that this was not discriminatory?
Basically, the assumption is that there is no prohibition currently that would prevent a small or an independent taxi company from entering into an exclusive agreement with a hotel provider if they so choose. So the playing field, if you will, is level. There's no prohibition one way or the other to prevent either a large company or a small company from entering into exclusive arrangements with any particular provider or hotel. So there's nothing that prohibits one versus the other. So that was at the base fundamental level. We separate the marketing issues from the concept that there's nothing that would prohibit an independent cab company from working out an exclusive arrangement with a hotel chain or a hotel place. It just what the issue is, the larger one seems to be doing it, but there isn't anything that would prohibit somebody from on the smaller side from doing the same thing or bundling themselves together and doing an exclusive arrangement. So there's nothing in that floor, and Kathy can elaborate, but that was, again, the legal finding that there isn't anything that prohibits that function from occurring right now.
But the cabs would say just the opposite. The cabs would say that the reason one firm can offer an exclusive is because it has 2/3 of the permits. that means the other firms cannot offer that kind of thing. And the fact that they have two-thirds of the permits is because we granted them the right to have two-thirds of the permits. So essentially, our standing ordinance, in essence, makes it impossible for any of the other companies to offer that same thing. They don't have the number of cabs to do it. So what's happened is that we have enacted a cab ordinance that, in essence, permits and encourages discrimination.
Well, and if I could talk a little bit just to that, you know, when we were considering taking off the cap of the number of taxi cab permits, it was the small companies that uniformly said, we don't want that. We don't want to see that happen. We want to keep that number in place. And we were going to consider that, if nothing else, to let them compete freely, but they said that that would do them more damage than good. So that was part of the reason why we considered, did we want to do this or not? And the other thing, as far as the hotels, you know, the issue really came back to, you know, they all just uniformly said they're going to choose whoever they want to do business with no matter what, and they took a big stand as to basically equating it to having Coke or Pepsi in their hotel. You know, they have the right to choose which company they want to have there, and they have a right to decide if they want to just exclusively do business with Coke or just with Pepsi. That's the way they see the same issue. While personally, I don't want to see small companies go out of business for any reason at all. You know, at the end of the day, I do have to give weight to that point that I do agree with the hotels industry standing on it. If they can choose Coke or Pepsi, why not? Which taxi cab they want to do business with.
But let's pursue that. Let's say if we forbid those exclusionary contracts and all those hotels could do whatever they want. That means every hotel would have to make its own decision as to whether they wanted to exclude every single other cab company or a particular cab company that gave them a problem. That would make it a little bit fairer playing field, because as it stands now, with the exclusionary agreement, all of them are forbidden not to be there, irrespective of whether they've ever done anything wrong. If the exclusionary agreements were gone, they could, in fact, decide, well, we only want to use yellow, or they could decide we want to use yellow in one or two other companies. But it would be their decision. It would not be a decision that was made possible by an exclusionary agreement. And as you know, Yellow has taken the position that they will not permit two exclusionary agreements. If they sign the exclusionary agreement, they're the only vendor. None of this other 7 or 8 can get a second exclusionary agreement. So what we have is we've got a playing field that's unbalanced and made possible because we've given Yellow two-thirds of the permits. That, to me, is discriminatory. Now, well, I shouldn't keep arguing with you. All I can say is I'm dissatisfied with the city's conclusion. I don't agree with it.
I understand how you feel, but it was really, at the end of the day, when we looked at that issue, I'll say personally for me, as I looked at that, it was made very clear to me, no matter what we did, that the hotels were going to choose to do business the way they're doing it right now. And if that meant no exclusionary contract, that was fine. They were going to do business with the company that they wanted to do business with. But following up with that, there's nothing right now with all of these companies if they have an exclusionary contract with Yellow Cab. And if Yellow, for some reason, can't make it there, they'll still use the small companies to come up and do business with them. And the small companies will take their trips and go ahead and do business with them whenever they're called. So it still is happening. It's just that they choose to use one company first, but they'll still use the others if they need to, and those companies will still respond.
But you also think that if we took the exclusionary agreements away, all of the others would come to the very same conclusion. We're going to exclude every single company except Yellow. That's, in the absence of exclusionary agreements, you're saying that's what would happen. I'm saying try it. Do away with exclusionary agreements, and if they want to sign, if they want to only permit Yellow, that's fine. But make the 11 or 12 of them make their own decision, and they shouldn't be making that decision based on the fact that Yellow says, if you sign with us, you can't sign with anybody else. We're the only vendor. And again, given the fact that the only reason Yellow can say that is because we gave them two-thirds of the permits. They're big enough to do that.
Can I go?
I'll stop.
Okay.
Can I go back to?
Can we give Mr. Reed a turn before we go back, if that's okay?
I was born ready. I'm ready. So I want to kind of go on. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to talk a little bit about kind of some of the concerns that Councilman Davis is raising, but I kind of want to go back to some of the information that you've presented. And the information you presented on one of the slides talks about a number of cities that you all looked at. Could you talk about which one of those model perhaps is actually working where the taxi code and the taxi network is operating the same, and which city is that happening the most in?
You know, basically, to start with that, like the city manager said, basically, you know, the Kansas City ordinance was already really strong, and most of it stayed intact. I mean, we found at the end of the day, after going through it, that a lot of it is we kept it and we just modified it somewhat. So we really found it was a very good, strong ordinance to begin with. But some of the things we looked at, you know, which cities are successful. This is all so new. I really would be doing an injustice to say, yeah, this is working great in one place or another, because as recently as just, I think, the last 6 to 8 weeks, the state of California has come back and said, ooh, we need to look at these background checks and what we granted the last time out. So this is so new, it's hard to say with any certainty what's really working well and what's not working well. The Dallas ordinance had some good stuff that we certainly used out of that, specifically with some of their insurance requirements. The Minneapolis ordinance had some good stuff as well. But we looked at all those, but at the end of the day, most of it tied back to Kansas City, and we used bits and pieces of some of the other cities to make it stronger. I think Dallas was most of the front runner at the end of the day with a lot of that.
What about Miami-Dade or any other place? I know Austin. Which one would you say is perhaps the top?
As far as
I hear what you're saying, but I want you to say, you know, I mean, you mentioned Dallas, you mentioned Minneapolis, you know.
Dallas is the model that we use.
So you
After
guys
reviewing all
looked
of
at
them,
Dallas is like the top one.
yeah, that was the one that, yeah, personally I favored the most, and I think we as a group liked the most.
Now, answer this question perhaps for me. Why is in this, I guess, recommendation or so, why is the transportation network in the same ordinance? Should they perhaps be two separate ones, or why are we going to consider?
I don't think they should be in two separate ones. At the end of the day, these are all vehicles for hire that provide service from point A to point B for a fee. So we wanted to keep it all together because a lot of Chapter 76 early on, when we call it vehicles for hire instead of Taxicab Code, that touches on all those different types of vehicles, whether it be the pedicabs, the transportation network vehicles, delivery vehicles, or the sightseeing vehicles. A lot of those rules apply to all of them. Then we break down certain sections to each one otherwise. And so when we get to another division about just livery and transportation network vehicles, that's a little more exclusive and specific to those companies. But all of this, they all blend together. So it made sense to keep it all together, but then break it out in areas where it needed to be broken out.
So is that perhaps like the best practices of what's happening in Dallas or other cities, or is that what we see across the country?
That's what we've seen is going back to the transportation network model in Dallas. A lot of what's working there we put that's going to be put in place. That's going to be with ours as well. So there's certainly, it's not written the same, but at the end of the day, it's written alike.
Yeah, I think it's an important distinction. One of the points that came out, and you've heard it in this committee, and we heard it in our public testimony, was Lyft and Uber are different. They're a different provider. But so what we tried to do is just kind of simplify it, get back to, at the end of the day, what you're hiring is a vehicle for hire for transportation. So that's why we lumped them in that. It's a model that I think the Dallas approach used, and when we saw it, it made some sense because it simplifies the argument. It doesn't matter what type of transportation choice you use, and there are now multiple choices. At the end of the day, you're hiring a vehicle to transport yourself transport you or someone from point A to point B. So it's essentially a vehicle for hire approach. So that's why we wanted to just simplify it, put it all in, and then break it down into the components of it, but broaden the use of that definition. So that the question was, if you're charging to transport somebody, you're hiring out a vehicle. So.
Now, into the contracts, kind of where Councilman Davis left off. You know, I've heard this example probably when we first started this discussion, where we started talking about Pepsi versus Coke. I was hesitant in saying this, but I will say it now. And that is that I think that is a bit insulting to think that we could use Pepsi or Coke as the example when we're talking about services. We're not talking about a drink. We're not talking about, oh, this is just what's best for, you know, someone who could come and put, you know, 50 cents, well, a drink probably now costs $1.50 or whatever. But, you know, put that in there. And versus somebody actually paying for service good to go somewhere in a car. It's a bit insulting to say that that's kind of the example we want to use for minority workers who are basically being discriminated against. And discrimination is discrimination, and we can try to hide it, but this is blatant, and it's unfortunate. And I think this example continues to be an insult.
Councilman, if I can, as we took this issue apart, it wasn't we recognizing the issues of our smaller independent cab companies. The fundamental issue that we got down to was what is the role of the city in terms of why we regulate these vehicles for hire. And it's an argument that we regulate these vehicles for hire because of the public safety component. An exclusive, and at the end of the day, we approach it from an exclusive contract between a hotel company and a taxi company does not necessarily negatively impact or positively impact public safety. So that was the kind of that fundamental issue. That's the fundamental policy choice too for you guys. But we looked at it from why the city regulates this is to protect public safety. That's why we kept in the requirements about the background check, the vehicle inspection, those proof of driver physical capability to protect the general public while they get into these vehicle for hire. So the question for you, is that too narrow of a definition, and that's the policy issue that we presented. We fundamentally just kind of brought it back to why does the city regulate the taxi or the vehicle for hire industry in this city? It's to protect public safety. So the exclusives don't necessarily have a negative impact or a positive impact on public safety. So that's kind of where we resulted at the end of the day, what way we settled where we did. So that's the policy question for you guys going forward. There is a regulatory issue in Miami-Dade, Florida that Kathy Adams mentioned, but we didn't find a linkage back to Kansas City that was strong enough that we thought we could recommend in the ordinance. That's why I think we need to put this out and let people chew on it for a while.
Now, and isn't there, Troy, some type of Supreme Court decision or ruling on that as well?
I'll have to defer to my legal expert.
Yes, in Miami-Dade, they did take it up, but again, that only dealt with exclusive contracts for taxis that they could not enter into exclusive contracts. Has nothing to do with the hotels, has nothing to do with anything else. As I said earlier, I did...
So what does it have to do with it, Kathy? I'm not sure if I'm following you.
Well, it basically tells taxicab companies that they are prohibited from entering into exclusive contracts.
With anyone?
Anyone.
So that could include a hotel?
That would include a hotel. Okay. The problem comes in is hotels without that contract can still exclusively use a particular taxi company. They get to choose who they call to their door. We cannot regulate the hotels. And as your testimony from the previous ordinance that I drafted that found that there was public safety concerns to have that ordinance, the taxi cab or the hotels stated very bluntly they could care less whether they have the exclusive contract or not. They are still only going to use one provider and allow one provider onto their premise.
So, but what was the ruling in Miami-Dade?
Miami-Dade said that they upheld the exclusive, that we could exclude taxi cabs from having exclusive contracts.
I'll let my colleagues jump in.
Two points. Any clarification? I thought, heard in last testimony, and then Mr. Davis alluded to it too, that the cap was part of the problem. And you, in your presentation, said you looked at it and didn't go there, and then further said that the smaller companies are insisting that the cap is not removed. So that, I'm confused by that scenario, because the thought, like that Councilman Davis is having, is the cap creates part of the problem, but then the people that we think it's creating the problem on are advocating to keep the cap. So can you walk me through that a little bit more so I understand it completely?
Sure.
And then the other side of that is, what does it do to the city or not do to the city itself to not have a cap?
Okay, first point, basically, like I said, when we looked at the cap, the small companies felt like they didn't want to increase that at all. And really, when you look at it, it's when you hear them explain it, it's easy to see why. At the end of the day, you have Kansas City Transportation Group, which is the largest company, and right now they can only have the number of permits that they have. They also have a pretty successful business, in Kansas with their 1010, and I don't want to misspeak, but I think they have around 125, 150 vehicles going that route. Now, let's say we were to take that number off, and I'm just speaking. I don't know what anybody would do.
Because I'm trying to understand both sides of the
Sure.
argument, because I thought I knew what the problem was.
Sure. So let's say we took the cap off, and then let's say that happened tomorrow, and then Kansas City Transportation Group said, hey, let's take our 1010 vehicles, let's take them on over to Kansas City. We want to go ahead and run them in Kansas City and run them over in Kansas anywhere else. So now there's another 150 cabs from Kansas City Transportation Group working in Kansas City, and the small companies don't necessarily have any extra revenue to build theirs up. Now you've just made the bigger company even bigger. I think that was certainly one of their fears to begin with. And so at the end of the day, they were much more comfortable saying, let's keep it where it's at. Now, as far as your first question, how would it benefit or hurt the city? I personally don't think it would. They have a thing that's called, it was deregulation where this whole thing kind of started. But deregulation, it's not necessarily about the number of cabs. That's just part of the equation. But there's plenty of cities that are all completely regulated, but they don't have a cap number. Minneapolis is one of them. Up there, when they made the change, I think they took off the cap. I can't remember the specific number, but I'm going to say it was around 600. I think then it jumped up to about 1,000, and then it jumped back down to around 8 or 850 before it worked itself out. Now, the little research that I've done on this, the idea with capping the number is it used to be the thought when a cab driver comes in to get one of these permits that they're going to be getting a fair amount of trips that they can sustain a living. So if you take the cap number off, and then certainly I'm one to believe in free enterprise, and so I believe the market would work itself out just like it did in Minneapolis. But does that mean a driver now is going to be working for 1 or 2 trips a day because there's so much competition? So that was the other concern. At the end of the day, it doesn't hurt the city. I don't believe one way or the other. If we have a cap or we don't, it doesn't hurt us.
So the cap really is to equalize the industry?
Yes.
Okay, so that creates the more level playing field for the small companies to play in the same arena as the big companies.
It does. Hearing it from the small companies, they think they'd be out of business even that much faster if that cap was lifted.
Okay, that's helpful, because when you just get bits and pieces and you think you know what an easy answer is, so the cap equalizes the industry here in Kansas City. One issue that I want to just make sure we have thought about all the way through, because it was just last year we had the other transportation that was, getting someone from their home to the doctor's office. I don't even know what we're calling that service itself. I can't remember. But you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, charitable nonprofit transportation.
Charitable nonprofit transportation. But we also I know that we have even small and large taxi cab companies that contract with school districts. So you have a meter car doing contracts. So by changing some wording, do we affect that scenario? I don't want to be doing something and then it pops up on the other side. Did we talk through that part too?
Yeah, but some of the things that we looked at, like with the sheriff fair and those types of programs, they don't necessarily have meters in them, and nothing precludes them from having contracts and setting stuff up and doing things like that. Okay. Now, if we found out it's going to be
Did we talk with the school districts about cabs delivering children to school from home? I know we have homeless children that we use cabs to transport from home to school because they move a lot, and that's how we keep them in the same school. I don't know all the details on that, but I know that we do have those services. I don't know if it's just meter and that's how it gets paid, or if that's contract. I hope that we've asked that question of the school districts on how do they engage with taxi cabs, because I can see them, they're obviously taxi cabs. They could be using other services, I'm not sure. But I know that I've seen cabs, all kinds, pick up kids to take to school. So I hope that we through this time period, not just wait for comment, that we dig in and call a few of our school districts and see how they manage that system for transportation of students.
That's something that I did not personally take into consideration. That's something we will certainly reach out and look into, because we do not want to negatively affect services that are already being provided. So we'll certainly take that point up. It's a good point.
Great, thank you.
Last question.
I'd like to comment a little bit about the cap, because I think the cap is necessary, and I think injecting it into this argument is unfair.
You did.
The issue of a cap is needed because without a cap, we might go from 500 to 1,000 vehicles. Obviously, we're not going to double the revenue when we do that, which means that every cab driver is probably making half the amount of money. Every cab is generating half the amount of money for its overhead. One of the reasons we're able to have a fairly high standard in terms of cabs is because of that cap of 500. What that does is it means that the market is shared among a smaller number of vehicles, which allows them to function the way that we expect them to function. Taking the cap off would be a major mistake, and I think a step in the wrong direction. I would like to comment, though, that one of the comments made earlier was the reason for this was to regulate the industry. I think when we established this, we were trying to accomplish a couple more things, and I'm glad we did. One was that this industry would really be a detriment to the city of Kansas City if we had a single monopoly of one cab company totally dominated the market. So we've essentially made that impossible to do with a cap of about 65% of the market. The other thing we did, and I am very impressed with that decision, is we tried to encourage minority and female-owned companies to be able to operate and flourish. Take that cap off, they're gone. If we don't eliminate the exclusionary contracts, they tell me they're gone anyway. Essentially what they're telling us, and I believe it, is that when we established the cap, we did establish a good market where minority firms could function and flourish. What's happened is the exclusionary contracts have come along and found a new way so that 65% can survive, but the 35% finds it difficult. So what we're probably going to do is force the market to get smaller by pushing those small companies out. I think that goal initially, to establish an industry that has an opportunity for minority and female firms to function and flourish, was a very valid one and should be preserved. And we've got to accept the reality that the exclusionary contracts right now are pushing those firms out of business. I hate to go back and say the only intent was to make sure we had a regulatory capability. We had three goals: regulatory capability, establish an opportunity for minority firms to operate. Those were our major concerns, and avoid a monopoly. We did that. We allowed this exclusionary contract to continue. We're undercutting the very basics of what we established when we set up those numbers.
Well, we have other things to do today besides talk about taxis. Can you rehash what the public process will be moving forward from today?
Before we get there, I'd like to, can we follow some numbers?
We have some other guests here, though.
I
That's
know,
my
I'm just
concern.
one more statement that I want to make, because your statement could be very well be correct, but I don't know that. So can we follow some numbers from when this conversation started till to now? Do we have companies that have closed? That would be really valuable information if we know because there is inclusionary contracts in place right now. We're aware of that. What has happened in the time from when they started to today, so we can see that information. That would be extremely helpful.
I'm sorry, what exactly would you be asking for then?
Do we have any companies that have left or gone out of business to date?
I've been told that I've been told that they are on the brink, but I don't know of any that are out of business as today.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
Rehash the process moving forward, please. Mr. Schulte was standing up to do that.
Yes, what we are proposing is that we will, in fact, we already have done. We have posted the draft ordinance, the PowerPoint, all the supporting information that you've got. We put it on KC Momentum. We put it on the city's website. What we would suggest we do is we take 30 days of public input, comments on the draft ordinance. They could provide that to regulated industries. We could incorporate any of those suggestions, changes, concerns, comments, present that to you, and our intent would be that we would officially file this document for your formal approval the first meeting in March, and start that, but take another 30 days of public comment on the draft ordinance itself as written. Again, this was a model that we saw in Texas that I kind of liked, that it allows for transparency. It doesn't say, we're going to put it out there and you guys can tear it apart, tell us what the issues are. They can, and then we'll try to, if there's some issues that we find as part of that, language changes or something like that, we will, we'll try to incorporate them into the formal ordinance, let you know what we've done as part of that issue and bring that to you in the month of March. The core issue, which would be the exclusives issue, which I think there's disagreement on, I think that's a fundamental policy decision for you guys as to what you think the scope is, and that's we'll continue to look at it. I'll rely on Kathy's judgment as we go forward. If she says here's a way that we can do it from a public safety standpoint, we will approach it from that concept. But this way, it's a very transparent, very open process, so they can engage online. We'll give information to regulating industry. If there's enough demand, we can hold another public hearing on and work through those issues. We're more than happy to do that. We just wanted to try to engage the process, engage the public a little more on that process.
All right, very good. I think that it's pretty clear after talking about this for over an hour that there's no fast path forward on this, so probably the 30-day period is well needed in this process. So with that in mind, we'll look to see you back here in about a month after the conclusion of that, and let us know what your draft ordinance looks like at that point. We do have, for the other folks that are here, we do have other things that we have to take care of today, and I have some other guests here from Operation Greenlight. So if I know some of you might want to chit-chat, please do so in the lobby and respect the other people that are here this morning. Thank you for your time.